a snapshot of the fleet as it stood about 2 years ago. For the background, as you all very well know, Russia's vast. It covers 2 continents, operates 4 major fleets, Northern, Baltic, Black Sea and Pacific Fleet, and it has a flotilla in the Caspian Sea, which is landlocked. It needs to function in Arctic waters and warm waters, it's coastal defence and open ocean power projection. And it has to negotiate either ice or geographical choke points for its fleets to really expand across the oceans and do their thing away from the homeland. And NATO in the past and various sort of alliances in the current day have a reasonably strong controlling influence over many of those choke points. So Russia feels a bit sort of hemmed in and threatened, obviously. I'm sure it's not paranoid, really. How do we find out details about Soviet platforms? Well, they come out to play quite often. They get past the choke points. We have an opportunity to spot them at the choke points. They sometimes come quite close to us when they do their manoeuvres and their exercises and their operations. We get quite close to them. Occasionally it gets a bit too close and the games get a bit rough. Sometimes they don't realise we're as close as we are, and we get photos like the one in the bottom right-hand corner, which has been on the internet a number of times, as a photograph of a propeller from a surface ship taken by a submarine. And in the centre there, we have a 1988 collision that occurred in the Black Sea between a Russian frigate, a Privat frigate, and I think it was Udaloy-class cruiser of the US that was in the Black Sea at the time. And you get a little bit of damage when that occurs, and we'll come on to that a bit later. The surface fleet nomenclature. NATO tended to label the Russian ships that appeared from time to time with they used names beginning with K for Russian surface vessels generally that were warships. It can get very confusing when you have Kynders, Kotlins, Komars, Kashins and Kanins and so on. What I'll try to do is show you a chart which helps to indicate the relationship between these various ships, and we'll look at some of them in more detail as models. More recently, with a more open Russia as it was, certainly until fairly recently, with more recent vessels, we've known what the Russian names were, and they tend to be used more than the NATO names in that case. But the Navy in Stalin's time, post-World War II, was the poor relations. Stalin was keen to learn the lessons of the Great Patriotic War. He was convinced that the Army and the Air Force were the 2 arms of his armed forces that were most important to national defence. And so the Navy was a bit of a poor relationship, but it began to build up again from the 1970s through the 1980s, but then reached a bit of a collapse as the Cold War ended. Russia was bankrupt, shipbuilding just was put on hold for many years, and a number of the new classes that were being designed and being introduced at that stage were stagnated. A few of them came back on stream more recently, but some of them have just become moribund and never been followed up. And quite often at arms shows these days, you find Russia will illustrate with some beautiful models some of the concepts that they have, but only some of those actually come to fruition because Russia's still economically and industrially quite limited. We'll have a chart in a minute that shows the relationships between the different surface ships, and a few of the drivers are highlighted and a few illustrations with deeper examples. Really, they're just a sort of starting point for you to do your own research if you want more details about any particular vessel. And there are some links I've indicated here, some Russian links in particular. 1 or 2 of them are fascinating. The 3D Defending Russia one, for example, you can go on that and you can get a 3D view around a Sovremenny destroyer and inside it and look around and in remarkable detail, really, considering some of these destroyers are still in service with Russia and China. I tend to be much more interested in the radars and the weapon systems than the ships themselves, I'm sorry to say, which probably will get me expelled from this society fairly shortly. But so things like davits, when it comes to my models, are probably not quite precise. Things like radars probably are. Radars on modern ships, they tend to come in 3 forms, really. You tend to get those that are sort of lattice, curvy sort of structures, a bit like the ones on the top right there. You get ones which are flat plates, as the one in the middle is indicated, and they tend to be phased array. They use a different physical principle for steering the beam. And a number of the radars are also covered over with a radome, a structure, as you can see in the middle picture on the lower part of that mast there. You can't see what's behind that radome, so you can't quite understand what kind of radar is there. But those tend to proliferate all over the Russian ships. You can also see various guns on ships. Ships still use guns for various purposes, even though missiles have taken the edge off the very large weapons that used to populate the battleships. Missiles, they might be launchable from a trainable arm launcher that would carry one or two or maybe three or four missiles and turn and elevate and point at the target. Or they might be launched from a vertical launch system, which is just an array of cells containing different kinds of missiles, and the missiles are launched vertically and then turn themselves over onto the right bearing to attack a target. Missiles can be anti-air, anti-surface, anti-submarines, and sometimes they have multiple roles. So, for example, some of the anti-surface missiles could be used for anti-land attack. Some of the anti-air ones could be used for anti-surface. So there's often a secondary role for some of these missiles. And ships still often carry torpedoes, both for anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare. And the other observable, which tends to be noticeable on modern ships, of course, is the helicopter deck of some form and a hangar, often to allow helicopters to be carried for a long period of time. And the electronic signature, which you can't see, but it can be observed if you've got the right sort of sensors. And of course, on each vessel, there's a number of unobservables. And here's a picture I really love. It's of a Russian trawler, the kind of thing that used to follow our warships around, and the American warships around the Mediterranean and elsewhere. It's a trawler, isn't it? But in that case, why does it have a sonar and torpedo tubes under the waterline? It does make you think about quite what the purpose of that trawler was. And I think as soon as a war turned hot, it would be making use of those facilities to try and take down what it was following. And I mentioned before the website that allows you to look around a Sovremenny destroyer. You normally can't see inside destroyers, but here's a picture of the main magazine in a Sovremenny destroyer with its 130mm shell array stacked right beneath the gun there. And I would recommend going on that website if you're not too frightened to go on Russian websites these days, and have a look around that kind of ship. Quite amazing. As far as terminology is concerned, for me, I tend to not make too big a distinction between destroyers and frigates, and sometimes cruisers as well. Quite often, large destroyers and small cruisers are very, very similar these days, and Russian nomenclature is very different from ours anyway. And you can find in navies such as the Russian Navy or the Chinese Navy, they have Coast Guard patrol ships that are significantly larger than we would consider as Coast Guard patrol ships. The Chinese have one that weighs something like 13,000 tons when it's fully loaded, which is, to me, a large cruiser rather than a patrol ship. But anyway, very broadly, I've divided this talk up into cruisers, where they're large warships with heavy armament, destroyers and frigates, which are the middle-going ones, and patrol vessels and corvettes, which are the smaller warships, which don't really have an open ocean capability. This is the big picture that I would build up. It's quite complex. There are an awful number of classes of aviation ships at the top, cruisers, frigates and destroyers in the middle, corvettes and missile patrol boats at the bottom. Many of those have evolved over the last 70 years or so, and we'll build that picture up slowly to show how the relationships come together. But different ships have a different focus. They might be anti-submarine warfare focused, they might be anti-surface warfare focused, or anti-air warfare focused. And the flavour of the focus tends to change over time. Much simpler picture. We start off in the early 50s, really, with the Russian Sverdlov cruiser and a couple of little missile patrol boats, the Como and the Osa, which are at the opposite end of the size scale when it comes to the Russian fleet. Sverdlov was really the sort of design pinnacle of Russian cruiser development after the Second World War. It was more or less a Second World War cruiser. It was armed with 4 triple 152mm guns, plenty of armour. It had a large number of anti-aircraft guns. It was mainly an eyeballs and physical gun kind of cruiser. I mentioned before that the Navy was a bit of the poor relation. Shipbuilding focused on vessels, really, which still had a direct gunfire capability. They were there to support the army and to support the air force. But the Sverdlov was quite a capable cruiser. It was something that prompted the UK to worry so much that we developed the Buccaneer aircraft and our tactical nuclear weapon capability, specifically to try and counter Sverdlov, because we estimated it would take maybe 80 or 90 conventional bombs to disable a cruiser of that kind, with all those defensive weapons on board it. But anyway, that was Sverdlov. We have a model of Sverdlov, and Comrig is fairly has an extensive range of models in 1/700 scale of all sorts of warships, from the Victorian era through to the modern day. They have a lot of modern Russian vessels because it is a Russian company. And these are resin cast vessels. The superstructures tend to be resin as well, which you just assemble on top of the cast hull. They tend to be a little bit short on detail. If you want to, certainly the older Conrig models, they don't have any photo etch, and you have to add aerials and railings and things yourself. But it makes a reasonable representation of the Sverdlov. It gives an idea of the size, it gives an idea of the weapon systems on it, and it has a couple of tiny little radars, quite primitive radars from the 1950s, still relying really on the eyeball to manage the guns. Parts on this are reasonably good, but there's very little vertical surface detail. It's certainly not as detailed as many of the more modern kits that you can get these days in this scale. The other end of the size scale, you've got the tiny little missile boats that Russia was producing and exporting in the late 50s, early 60s. Komar was a little tiny missile craft carrying 2 Styx missiles, and this really shook the world in 1967 when a couple of Komars were able to fire their missiles from their harbour in Egypt and destroy an Israeli destroyer. The Israeli destroyer had no indication this was about to happen. The missiles proved that by 1967, you could have an autonomous anti-ship missile which could destroy a frigate or a destroyer-sized target with a single hit. And the world woke up to the power of these missile-armed combatants and the need to develop some kind of countermeasures for defeating those missiles if they were going to survive in the waters of the world. Komar only carried 2 missiles. The one that followed after it was the Osa, which carried 4 Styx missiles. And this is a 700 scale little model of Osa that you can see here, along with its shadow, just to give a different view of the size of it. So in the bottom corner here, you can see the size of the Osa patrol boat compared to the Sverdlov cruiser. Absolutely tiny, but very, very potent. The only limitation really is that it's not open ocean, it's not got endurance for long patrols, but that isn't necessary for many of the users of that vessel. It meant that small navies could pack a big punch. And the little tiny missile boat is a kit from Dragon. They produce a little missile boat kit. It's about 5 centimetres long, and it comes along in the kit with a couple of other little missile boats, and Nanuchka and Tarantul as well. And just to show the sort of level of detail, at the top you've got the 700th scale Osa. At the bottom, I have made up the 72nd scale Osa that Merit produce. That's a lovely kit. You get all sorts of massive detail on that, which you obviously can't get with the 700th scale. But trying to build up my Soviet fleet in 72nd scale would probably break the bank as well as being totally unwieldy. So I've stuck to 700 scale. Looking at the chart again, we have the Sverdlov, and we have the Komar and the Osa. We then go through the 1960s and early 70s with a rash of vessels which started off being designed as gun vessels and then migrating either through the same hull with different weapons fits, the Kotling, Kilding, Cannon and Kashin, migrating towards more use of missiles rather than guns, or in the case of Sverdlov, converting to moving on to Kynda and Kresta, a new hull form specifically to take the new missiles and new weapon systems and the fairly top-heavy radars that were coming online then. And we're moving from guns to missiles rather, and eyeballs to radars, and making sure that the missile patrol boats have their place as well. We have 2 models here. There's the Sverdlov one we saw before, and now beneath it we've got a Kynda-class cruiser, which was the first one that really took off when it came to missile armament. And you can see the differences here. Most of the guns have been removed, still a few at the back, but they're not the really big heavy guns that the Sverdlov used. Instead, we have 2 quad packs of anti-ship missiles at the front and rear of the ship. They're trainable, they can be turned around and point in the right direction, guided by the radars that you can see on the top superstructure there. And that's the main anti-ship armament on that vessel. You've also got torpedo tubes still, that hasn't been removed, torpedoes still have a place. And at the very front of the ship, you've got two kinds of weapon system. One with the arrow against it is a surface-to-air missile system. So this is beginning to replace some of the anti-air guns that were on the Sverdlov. And then just ahead of that, you've got some anti-submarine mortars to provide a close-in anti-submarine weapon system. So here you've got a very capable multi-mission ship, and guns are definitely in the descendancy and missiles in the ascendancy. Again, it's a Combrig model. It's quite an old one. Again, not much in the way of surface detail. If you look at the masts, they're very plain. Sides of the ship, very plain. Here's a plastic model rather than the resin model of a Kiev-class destroyer. This again, same sort of era. This is now still retaining a few guns, but replacing most of the guns with missiles. So you've got some anti-ship, anti-submarine missiles in the bow of the ship. Again, this trainable 4-missile launcher. Often when these ships came out, the West didn't really have a good idea as to what kind of missiles were in those launchers. Launchers looked fairly similar. They could be anti-surface ship, they could be anti-submarine missiles. The Kiev-class, though, were very much anti-submarine platforms, and they had good sonars, they had the missiles at the front there. They've got some anti-aircraft missiles that are actually hidden beneath the deck until they're required. And you can see some anti-submarine mortars just in front of the bridge as well. Torpedo tubes are retained. Small 76mm guns are retained at the back as well. And the Kiev-class, although they came in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, that basic design has carried through to the current day. And there's some vessels which have more or less the same hull form, more or less the same mast structure, both for internal use and for export at the moment. The big reason for this, of course, is that by this stage, the UK and the USA had ballistic missile submarines which could threaten the Russian homeland, and Russia needed both the Kynda-class cruisers that we saw on the previous slide and these Kiev-class destroyers to go out into the open ocean, try and interdict the ballistic missile subs before they could threaten the Russian homeland. So the mission of the Navy became one very much of protecting their own submarines, attacking enemy submarines at the outset of war, away from the previous mission of really just supporting the Navy and the Army in a land battle. Kiev destroyers, I mentioned, they were developed alongside the larger cruisers. The Kyndas evolved into the Krestas, and the emphasis went from anti-surface warfare to anti-submarine warfare. What we've got here is a slightly blown up photograph of a Kresta 2 cruiser, which is an anti-submarine one, similar sort of shape to the Kynda. But this one is actually a 3D printed model from Shapeways. Shapeways are a firm in the Netherlands that allow you to order all sorts of different things made from 3D printing. Unfortunately, if you want to get a very high resolution print, you have to pay an absolute fortune. I paid for the lowest quality print, and it sort of shows in the model there. By eye, it's not too bad because at 700 scale, it is smaller than the photograph here, but you can see the lines where the 3D printing has layered build-up of the hull here and the masts. An awful lot of the fittings, certainly all the radars and all the guns and torpedo tubes, were useless from a 3D print, and I had to cut them off and replace them with plastic fittings that I bought from elsewhere. So that was a bit of an experiment. I wouldn't necessarily go for a 3D print unless it's remarkably discounted at the moment. But that was bought about 5 years ago. Things have improved now, and probably the resolution for the price is improving all the time. And we'll see a couple of examples of 3D printed chips a little bit later. Of course, for anti-submarine warfare in open ocean, it would be nice to have an aircraft carrier. The Russians were fairly slow to build up their aircraft carrier capability. They started with anti-submarine warfare through-deck cruisers, really, a bit like our Invincible-class carriers. Here we have Kiev-class. This one's actually probably the third of class. The radar fit's a little bit more advanced, but you can see the basic design. You've got almost a through deck for the aircraft to operate. These aircraft are Yak-38s, which are kind of VTOL equivalent of the Harrier, though far less capable. The Russians can't give up their missiles, though, and you can see on the right-hand side, I think that's 12, it's 12 missile tubes for anti-submarine warfare missiles. So clearly this ship believes it needs to be able to defend itself as well. Just in front of those, you've got some anti-air missile silos, and also towards the stern, if you look down towards where the 3 Yak fighters are parked on the rear deck there's 6 little circles there, which represent the anti-air warfare missiles that are in those silos there. So it's got lots of missile defences, lots of missile offences, as well as having the organic air to be able to prosecute anti-submarine warfare, and for that matter, anti-surface warfare over quite a wide radius. Still not a proper aircraft carrier, though. And there are various documents you can pick up. If you look on one of the references I gave earlier was the CIA reading room. There are an awful lot of previously classified Russian articles which the Americans got hold of in the middle of the Cold War. They kept as CIA translated documents at high classification for many years, but they're now being declassified and published, and you can read what the thoughts were from Russian admirals and other people in their own internal documentation back 40 or 50 years ago, which is absolutely fascinating if you've got the time to dive into it. But the highlighted element here in the extract is an admiral talking about the role of the Navy in about the mid-1970s. So in the nuclear world war, the Navy will participate in the destruction of important objectives on enemy territory. It will destroy enemy nuclear missile submarines. That's the key thing. And carrier strike units, because, of course, carrier strike was also a big threat to the homeland. They'll interdict shipping in oceans and sea lanes and protect their own shipping, carry out amphibious landings, destroy the enemy, and fulfill other missions that arise during armed combat at sea. And then there's also the line that in peacetime, the interests of socialist countries necessitate a show of force by our Navy in different parts of the world. So that's flying the Russian flag. And of course, that's to contain aggressors and the capitalists and the forces of the enemy and so on and so forth. So what we've got by about 1980 here is a lot of emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, recognition that the nuclear submarine is a really critical threat. All the platforms have strong air defences, mainly missile-based, and the ability to project power in open ocean. So we're building up an all-round Navy, and now we get to the production in the 1980s of assets which are certainly in service at the moment, or one or two of them might not be in service given the events in the Ukraine. But here we've got a nice model. It's a plastic model, a trumpeter model of the Slava-class missile cruiser. You can see the missiles ranged in 4 lots of pairs of missiles on each side. So you've got 16 missile tubes in this cruiser. Nice big 130mm gun at the front, a twin gun. Various radars, various other vertical launch cells for anti-aircraft missiles on it. This is the sister ship of the Moskva that the Ukrainians managed to sink quite spectacularly at the beginning of the recent conflict. So Russia still has a couple of those floating around at the moment. They're old, but they are still reasonably potent. And this was an example of the Soviet Navy coming of age. It fielded anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, and anti-air warfare assets worldwide. You had the Slava here, and you had the 2 destroyer frigate-sized vessels, the Udaloy and Sovremenny, which we'll see in a moment. And they became the core workhorses of the Navy. And they also looked at building some stealthier warships. We heard a little bit earlier about the Type 23. Type 23 in the UK was a pretty stealthy warship. The Russians tried to emulate that kind of thing, but they were hampered by funding crises towards the end of the Cold War. Here we've got Sovremenny destroyer, one of my favourites, really. This particular one, pennant number 413, it came into Portsmouth Harbour in about 1990 and paid a port visit. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen down, had been taken down. The Soviet Navy was keen to show how friendly it was, so this thing came into Portsmouth Harbour. One of my colleagues was hosting it for a week and had the opportunity to crawl all over it, almost literally. It looked very good and had been painted beautifully for the port visit. But if you looked slightly underneath the paint, you found that lots of things were rusted. So, for example, the top left-hand corner, we've got a nice picture of the helicopter deck, and this is the 1/700th Dragon and Zvezda scale model of the Sovremenny. It's a plastic kit, very nice. If you buy the aftermarket photo etch to go with it, it makes a very, very nice model. You can see in the top left-hand corner, you've got a nice little helicopter on the helicopter pad, and there's to the left of it, there's a telescopic hangar which can come out to accommodate that helicopter. Now, my colleague, when he actually had a good chance to look at this, he found that the rails on which that telescopic helicopter hangar came out were so rusted that it couldn't possibly have operated. So it looked good, but in practice, the ship maintenance and presumably also some of the crew capabilities, being a conscript crew, weren't quite up to the image that was projected by the magnificent Soviet Navy with its fresh coat of paint. It's a lovely model, this. I made this as a retirement present for the guy who I was mentioning just now, because he also likes Sovremenny as one of the nicest Russian warships. Again, you've got missiles on the side here, the 2 quad packs of SSN-22 anti-ship missiles, which are absolutely fascinating and very capable anti-ship missiles, very, very dangerous. Again, you have guns on it. Sovremenny is generally a sort of anti-surface, anti-air warfare destroyer. It's got plenty of anti-air missiles, it's got guns, it's got helicopters, it's got anti-ship missiles here. We see its stablemate, the Udaloy. Again, Udaloys are still in service, as are Sovremenny's. Udaloy had a slightly different emphasis, being anti-submarine warfare. For a start, if we look at the stern, it's got space and hangar space for 2 helicopters, so it can double its prosecution of submarine targets using helicopters. The next arrow towards the middle of the ship, you've got the anti-submarine mortars, and towards the front, underneath the bridge, you've got, again, a pair of quad packs of missile launchers. These are anti-submarine missile launchers. And again, you've got guns at the front, you've got anti-air missiles ahead of that, plenty of radars to guide those systems. So Udaloys are very, very capable. And we'll talk a little bit more about Udaloys on some slides further on. Kirov is the other thing that came out in the 1980s. The 4 Kirov-class battle cruisers were absolutely formidable. They're about the size of an Iowa-class US battleship, absolutely huge. Could take helicopters towards the rear, plenty of hangar space for that. And you can see this area ahead of the bridge, which is absolutely jam-packed full of vertical launch tubes for anti-ship missiles and anti-aircraft missiles. Very, very capable. Also, a fair number of anti-aircraft guns scattered around the ship, and a formidable array of electronic sensors and radars on board as well. Obviously, a ship of this size is also used as a flagship or a command vessel, so there's plenty of space for admirals to do their thing, as well as the captain of the ship to actually try and get on with running the ship. And there's a little photo in the bottom corner there showing some of the enormous size of the vertical launch cells underneath the deck of the ship here. Absolutely enormous. And the range of these missiles, some of the anti-air missiles, they've got ranges of, say, 100 kilometers. So you can create a defensive bubble around the ship, preventing air attack, and you can prosecute attack against surface ships, maybe 200, 300 kilometers away from the core of your battle group here. So it's a very, very capable ship. 4 were built. 3 ended up getting very, very rusty after the Cold War ended. 1, Peter Velicki, has stayed in service and has been the Northern Fleet flagship for some time. One of the old mothballed ones is now being refurbished and re-equipped with modern weapons and sensors, and it will probably come away from the dockyard wall in another year or 2 and become the new flagship of the Northern Fleet. And Peter Velicki, which is the one that's illustrated here, will go into refit and come out again a few years later. So there will be 2 in service with a modern equipment fit fairly shortly. The hulls are still quite reasonable. Nuclear powered as well, which I think caused a few problems for the Soviet Navy. These are always escorted at sea by an ocean-going tug just in case they break down. Finally, middle of the 80s, beginning of the 1990s, Russia managed to get an aircraft carrier that was a proper aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. It's only had 1. fully built in service. It's got a bit of a ski ramp at the front, but it operates conventional takeoff and landing aircraft. It's been worked quite hard over the past 30 years or so. Most recently, it saw a lot of service off Syria in the sort of late 2015 to sort of 18 period. Had a few accidents with its aircraft. The Russian Navy isn't that good at operating aircraft carriers since they've only got one to play with. And it's currently a refit at the moment. There's been a refit for many, many years. They have all sorts of problems, such as floating docks sinking and cranes falling on the carrier itself when they shouldn't do. Interesting thing about this, particularly from the overhead shot, if you look towards the front of the deck just before the ski ramp, it still has 12 missile launch tubes in it for anti-ship missiles. The Russians can't get away from fitting rather capable missiles to any every ship that they operate. Go to the right a little, towards the aircraft at the front, you've got, right a bit, it's like the old golden shot, up a bit. Where the arrow points, basically, you've got those 12 vertical launch tubes for missiles in the middle of the flight deck. It's quite incredible, really. But the other ones that John was pointing at, a little bit further back on the ship, they're anti-aircraft missile silos. You've got 12 of those at the front and 12 of those at the stern. You've also got some close-in weapon systems, a bit like our sort of phalanx and goalkeeper, but slightly more capable. I made a real error with this model. This is a trumpeter model. I put loads and loads of life buoys on the side of the vessel, which they should be there. Many of the photos of Kuznetsov show the life buoys missing. I think it's a Titanic waiting to happen, actually. They're not very good at looking after their crew. Right, we've built up our chart. Towards the top, the aviation ships, we've finally gone from Moscow through Kiev, and we've got Kuznetsov as an aircraft carrier. We've got the Udaloys and the Kirovs and the Slavas. Udaloy, there was one Udaloy 2 made where there was a bit of a change around in the weapon fit, but it wasn't really much different. You've got Sovremenny, you've got Krivac frigates moving towards the Shermi, which was a stealthy attempt at a frigate, but wasn't terribly successful. But by and large, the Soviet Navy has rebalanced their force with powerful ocean-going anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare units and really consolidated on the designs that worked quite well for them. And towards the bottom, you've still got lots of corvettes and missile and patrol boats for homeland and export. Today, probably the wrong photos to show for modernization, but anyway, the Soviet Navy rotted for years when there was no funding from 89 through to about 2010. Nobody really cared about the Navy, the crews weren't paid, the ships weren't maintained. But the last decade has seen a bit of a resurgence of innovative designs, and they've crystallized into a few core projects for the future Navy, but supported by refurbishments of the best legacy platforms. So the legacy platforms such as Udaloy and Kirov classes are being re-equipped with new radars and weapon systems to give them a bit more lease of life, whilst the new projects are going through their teething troubles and eventually getting built in reasonable numbers. But the more modern platforms use modular vertical launch systems to allow multi-role deployments. So if you look at Admiral Kuznetsov in the top corner there, you can just about make out behind the main gun at the front there's 2 banks of vertical launch cells for missiles, and they're flexible vertical launch cells, whereas the old ships in the 70s and 80s, you had a particular kind of missile that fitted in a particular kind of cell. These are now very much plug and play. They're a bit like your USB bits and pieces you can add to your computer. Basically, you can put an anti-ship or anti-submarine or anti-air missile into the same vertical launch cell and swap out your missile loads and equip your vessel for the role that it's about to undertake over the next month or two, rather than having to decide at build on the ratio between your different kinds of missiles. It's a fairly stealthy design. It's got not too many angular bits and pieces on the deck to reflect radar returns. A lot of things are behind doors, so things like davits and small boats that you hang out, and some of the other bits and pieces that you find on the deck of a ship are all also enclosed so that they can't be seen by radar and therefore don't give a good radar return. So it's a more streamlined design, really. And you can see also on the main mast, the radars have moved away from the large lattice type arrays to flat planar phased array radars using modern technology. Udaloy, as I mentioned, some of the legacy platforms are being upgraded. I've taken the trumpeter models of Udaloy. The top one there is the plain Udaloy with its original fit from the 1980s. So you can see the guns at the front. You can see various bits and pieces like the torpedo tubes towards the rear. And at the bottom here, we've got a pit road model of the Udaloy where I've upgraded it to make it look like the latest refit of an Udaloy that's going on at the moment in one of the shipyards. So you can see at the front, new gun, slightly better turret, but one of the guns has been replaced with a vertical launch set of launchers, so it can take various missiles in that. The old missiles that were just beneath the bridge in large tubes, they were anti-submarine warfare missiles. These have been replaced with anti-surface warfare missiles, which are the sort of Russian equivalent of Harpoon. So you can see the quad mount there, quad mount on either side, and again further towards the stern. So just forward of the hangar space, you can see there's a new box construction, which has taken the place of the previous anti-submarine warfare mortars, and instead has replaced it with some general purpose vertical launch cells again. It's a bit of a monstrosity, that construction there, but it serves a purpose. It gives a little bit more life to an Udaloy-class destroyer. A patrol ship. We talked about patrol ships at the very beginning, how potent they were. There are echoes of this now because small patrol ships fitted with maybe only 8 vertical launch cells can actually contain missiles that have a land attack capability out to about 4,500 kilometers, which is absolutely enormous. You can sit in the Caspian Sea in one of your little patrol boats and fire a land attack missile against the UK, which is startling and slightly worrying. It almost mirrors the kind of effect that the Russians had with their submarines. Early Cold War, the Russian submarines, in order to attack the USA, had to sit off the eastern seaboard. As things matured and developed and they got longer range missiles, they were able to hide them in bastions up under the ice and not come out to play, but they could still be very potent and reach the USA. The similar sort of thing is happening with land attack missiles from surface ships. You've now got tiny vessels that don't need to operate in the open ocean that can hit most places on Earth, which is worrying, certainly. Russia's used these vessels to conduct strikes in Syria, for example, which is a much shorter range than about 1,000 kilometers, but they've proved the point that they're capable of using them. And they're quite hard for us to interdict because, of course, that's Caspian Sea, that's landlocked. It'd be very difficult for the West to get assets to prosecute those vessels. And here's a model. This is one from Yufeng Models, which is a Chinese company. If you go on eBay, you can find all sorts of interesting Chinese companies producing little models. This is a modern resin cast 1/700 scale ship. It's about 9 centimeters long in total. A lot of the fittings, though, are photo etch and 3D printed, and they're much, much better than the 3D print I showed you earlier. But these things are quite amazing. The detail's excellent. Some of the fittings are so small, I just give up and can't put them on. They're too tiny and fiddly for me. So you put on as many as you can and then stop before you destroy the vessel that you're trying to put more bits and pieces onto. But again, these little tiny boats, you can see I've done an insert of the vertical launch cells. There's a lot of detail there. You've got photo etched covers. You've got tubes that go into the vessel itself. So very, very detailed, very nice. And you get 2 in the box. It was about £30 to get a box of 2 little patrol boats. And I think these little Chinese manufacturers are producing an amazing array of new models at a fantastic rate. A lot of them are Chinese vessels. If you want to build up a Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy for display at 1/700th, then eBay and China is the way to go. We've more or less completed our chart. So what we've got now in the current era is upgraded best legacy platforms as a stopgap, some unification towards some stealthy general purpose blue water warships, and similarly with corvettes and patrol vessels, sort of tailoring towards 2 or 3 designs that seem to be coming out of the mix over the past few years that work, that are stealthy, that are capable. Here's an example of one of the patrol vessels. It's called Mercury. Very stealthy. Almost everything is enclosed in a slab-sided hull form. You've got a multi-mission bay underneath the helicopter deck, which can take ISO container type equipment of various kinds. It can hide boats. You've got some harpoon type missile launchers in the middle there, which are covered by shutters until they're actually used. You've got some vertical launch cells at the far front there. And Russia's building that sort of patrol ship, also versions of that patrol ship, which are icebreakers, so they can penetrate the Northern Sea route all through the year. And certainly as the world warms, that will become a more frequent operating area for the Russians and for others who use that route. And then a footnote. I've focused on warships, but I do like all the other esoteric ships that float around the sea as well. This is an intelligence gathering ship. Again, it's a convrig ship, convrig model, but it's one of their very recent ones, and they come up with much, much better photo etching, much, much better resin cast detail. This is about 8 centimeters long in reality. It's an intelligence gathering ship that's particularly tailored towards missile tracking. So you've got this massive great phased array radar on the back here with the arrow pointing towards it. Various other sensors on it as well. An older convrig model, this is an Alligator-class landing ship. Populated it with the stuff that it was carrying through the Turkish Straits coming out of the Black Sea when it was trying to support some of the Russian operations in Syria. And then finally, I couldn't resist making the Kiev-class frigate that collided in the Black Sea in 1988. So I had a dry dock little model that I put the Kiev in and scraped the bow to represent the rather nasty collision that it had. Wind up round about here, just a summary. My 700th collection has been built over the last 8 years. Scale gives a good balance between detail and storage space. And I've got UK, US and Chinese fleets that are similar, so I need lots of storage space. Models come from the various manufacturers that I put there. A lot of them do need aftermarket care, such as photo etch or fittings. Though, as I say, these newest Chinese kits from weird manufacturers have a very, very good combination of resin etch and 3D printed parts. And build time, because I'm a mass producer rather than probably what Jim does, which is spend about 5,000 hours on each of his models, I spend somewhere between about 5 and 25 hours on each one. So apologies for the quality of some of them. And that's where I shall stop. There's another view of the fleet.